Baseball season may be over, but for the governor, it's 3 strikes and he's out when it comes to the budget. Here to talk to me about this and more is State Representative Steven Mentzer. Representative, welcome.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for having me back so soon. I know it's very important for our constituents to keep updated, particularly during this budget impasse. So I appreciate it, and let's get to the information we need to get to these constituents.
Well, we had a great program a few weeks ago, and before we get into what's happened since then, why don't we talk a little bit, give us a little update on the timeline. How did we get to where we are now?
That's great. I think we should do that. In March, the governor proposed the largest tax increase in Pennsylvania's history. Our leadership and the governor talked for about 2.5 to 3 months. And it was evident to our leadership that the governor didn't seem to feel that the constituents in Pennsylvania or the people of Pennsylvania were interested in that kind of a tax increase. So on June 1st, the House voted on his exact budget plan, that $8 billion tax increase, and that vote did not receive one positive vote. So on June 1st, the realization was his original proposal was not feasible. On June 30th, the House proposed its own budget along with the Senate that passed the House and Senate, and he promptly vetoed that bill. In addition, we proposed a pension reform bill and a liquor privatization bill, which he proceeded to veto. He didn't just do a line item veto, he did a total veto, which was a real problem for social service agencies and our educational system. So on August 24th, we proceeded to try to override some of those vital line items. And we were not successful to garner the votes for the override. So now that places us in September, where we tried once again to drive money to those social service agencies and educational institutions by proposing an emergency funding bill. And that bill passed, but again, it was vetoed recently by the governor. Which brought us to this past week, October 7th, where we took a bill that he had suggested or ideas that he had suggested during negotiations and voted on that on the floor, and it did not garner the votes to pass. So that's kind of the timeline.
And let's talk about October 7th just briefly. The governor said he had the votes, and we knew that based on the breakdown in the House, it just wasn't going to take the Democratic caucus. He needed votes from the Republican caucus. And he was confident that he had not only the entire Democratic caucus, but votes from the Republicans. And when it all came down, the Republican caucus stayed united. And there were 9 Democrats that did not vote with him on this massive tax increase.
Exactly. And the only thing that suggests to me is that now we have a baseline, a better baseline for negotiations. And hopefully now we can move into some kind of a reasonable compromise. Somewhere between what was proposed by the House and Senate back on June 30th and this proposal that was defeated previously.
So why don't we talk a little bit about the proposal? The governor made a lot of changes from the plan he's been, I guess, basically campaigning with all over the state for the past couple months. It was a very different plan that we saw hit the House floor back on October 7th. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the bill that he, or the ideas that he had during negotiations had a personal income tax and a sales tax in it, and it also had this extraction tax. But when we finally saw the final version, which we only saw about a day and a half before the actual vote, he had stripped out the sales tax and added some other smaller items. So even from the time that he had originally talked about some kind of a compromise, he had changed that. So,
and can we talk a little bit about the personal income tax, because this is the tax that was going to hit the average homeowner, the average working person the hardest, and that saw the biggest change.
Exactly. When we finally saw the details of his proposal, what we found out was that in his proposal, 95% of the revenue came from the personal income tax, and only 5% came from the severance tax. So basically, this is a personal income tax increase. And the severance tax has turned out to be a real myth. The governor has been suggesting over the past year that a severance tax on the natural gas industry would generate $1 billion a year. Anthony, when we saw this package, we found out that it only is going to generate $95 million this year and somewhere between $200 million and $300 million next year.
And they were his numbers.
They were his numbers, which came down from $1 billion, which is something I've been suggesting for a long period of time here. So the point of this is that the personal income tax coming from hardworking Americans and Pennsylvanians are actually being affected here. The severance tax is really not much of an issue.
We know that there's been some, as you mentioned, some, disagreement over how much the severance tax was going to bring in. What did the House Republican, we know we got the Appropriations Committee, what were their projections? And do you believe that that is a sustainable tax to fix Pennsylvania's problems?
The natural gas industry is faced with an economic reality, and that is that energy prices have fallen dramatically. And Pennsylvania is even in tougher shape than the rest of the nation. We have so much natural gas in Pennsylvania, and we can't get that natural gas to market. So the market price for natural gas in the United States is about $2.80 per thousand cubic feet. But guess what? In Pennsylvania, it's $1.10, maybe $1.50. These guys can't make any money at that price. So I have a real problem with even our own Appropriations Committee's estimates of $196 million from a severance tax. I don't believe we're going to see that. I don't think we're going to realize that. I spent 25 years in the investment business. I've seen periods of time between 5 and 7 years where energy prices have stayed low. I think we can all look back and remember that. If we get into a situation like that, we're not going to be able to generate anything like that from the severance tax.
Now, we know we talked on the last program that the governor has hit your district with mailers about fallacies with the severance tax. Is the severance tax something that you can support and vote for?
Absolutely could support a severance tax, but it has to be a reasonable severance tax. Let's talk about the severance tax that he proposed. The effective rate of the severance tax that he proposed is 14%. At 14%, it would be the largest severance tax in the nation. We would be uncompetitive with our neighbors and anyone else in the United States. To me, that's not reasonable. I have always suggested that if we take a reasonable severance tax and replace the impact fees, then I am in full support. When the natural gas industry is able to generate funding in Pennsylvania from our natural resources, we should share in that. I'm all about that. But I'm also have been in the investment business for a long time and know that you cannot be the highest tax in the United States without having it affect your state adversely. And so that's pretty much where I stand on that.
You mentioned the impact fee, and in the governor's, projections, it included revenue from the impact fee and from the severance tax. But we know that according to law, the way the law was written, if the severance tax was put in place, the impact fee was supposed to go away.
Right.
However, he did not account for that. What was his way of getting around that, or getting around law, basically?
I'm assuming there was some legality in here that he felt he could get around that. But I think we need to go back to the basic principle. We got to be realistic here. We have to be realistic in our estimates on what this industry is going to generate for Pennsylvania when we're looking at the budget. And I just don't believe $1 billion is anything close to what we can realize. And now we find out neither does the governor. And I can't even believe his $350 million figure. I'm not even sure I can believe the $196 million figure that our own Appropriations Department is suggesting. And let's take a look at that, because in his proposal, he's talking about the personal income tax as the generator and the severance tax. But he does not account for the privatization of wine and spirits. He vetoed that. But if you look at our figures on what that might generate, that could easily generate $200 million a year every year for Pennsylvania. Well, now, that's as much, if not more, than what we might generate from an extraction tax. So why can't we go back to talking about that?
Well, let's talk a little bit about wine and spirits and also something else that was missing, pensions. The governor did not account for the pension problem that Pennsylvania is facing. Is that the right move to kick that can further down the road?
Absolutely not. This budget has $400 million to $500 million more in it for payments to our pension system. 400 to 500 million more. That's as much as the governor asked for increases in education funding. So for us to go into budget season and ignore the reforms that are absolutely necessary for our pension system, to me, is not realistic. There are two things missing here: privatization of our wine and spirits and pension reform. Those things have to be on the table and cannot be disregarded.
Finally, the governor, since he gave his budget address, he has pounded on property tax relief. He has said that his budget plan would give property tax relief to all of Pennsylvanians. When it came down for the vote, was that in the bill that the language of the bill that he put forth?
It was rebates for rent rebates and property tax rebates, but guess what? It only applies to 2% of Pennsylvania's population. 98% of the homeowners will get absolutely no relief. We passed out of the House a dollar for dollar reduction in property taxes for everyone. A dollar for dollar reduction. And I believe we should move forward with a plan like that. And I just don't think this is a significant property tax plan.
All right, Representative Mentzer, where do we go from here?
I am extremely concerned about the educational institutions and the social service agencies that are being held up, and the funding being held up because we do not have a budget impasse. And let's go back to this. First time in my lifetime, this governor did a complete veto of this budget, which did not allow for 70% of the agreed upon line items to flow to these agencies. Now, this can't continue. I know we've tried to override his line items. I know we've tried an emergency funding bill, which was vetoed, but I'm going to continue to urge our leadership to think about a emergency funding override. I mean, we saw from this vote that there is some dissension from the governor's budgetary ideas, 9 so far. Hopefully there'll be 7 or 8 more members from across the aisle that might consider releasing funding to those needed social service agencies and educational institutions. So that's where I hope that we go immediately. Long term, I believe we will come to a budget agreement. And I really believe that the sooner the better, and this most recent vote should be a clear indication to our governor that he's going to have to be realistic here moving forward.
All right, Representative, I hope you're correct. It seems after a press conference the governor had after the vote, he seemed to look at this as a win, but I did not see any winning for him on the 7th.
Yeah, I didn't either.
All right, look forward to having you back when we have more on the budget situation.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today's program. If you have questions about what you've just heard or any other state-related matter, Representative Mentzer's contact information will be on the screen in just a moment. Thanks for watching, and please join us again next time for another edition of Legislative Report.